Thank you, Wim. Thank you for the organizers to present here on sugars, metabolism and exercise. Declaration of interest. I have no commercial interest. I'm not sponsored by the industry at that stage. I'm leading a program Health Food Innovation Management at Maastricht University as full-time professor. What I will talk about is a little bit on sugars and energy in the athletes. There have been various focuses over the past. One focus has been that fat is important, followed by a focus that the athlete especially needs protein. And I still remember Ajax in the Netherlands, the soccer players who were eating a steak early in the morning before the competition because it was thought that that was the best energy source. We now know that that is not the case. We know that there is a role for sugars, and if we talk about sugars and exercise, you can say, well, is there a need? And if yes, when is there a need? And what type of sugars do we talk about? Well, we have different types of carbohydrates. Luke just reviewed comparisons of fructose versus glucose. Then we have sucrose, and interestingly, if you look to most of the research that see a role of fructose that is distinct from glucose, it are comparisons of pure fructose versus pure glucose. And you should know in real life we never consume pure fructose. We always consume it along with glucose. And most of the effects seen if you have pure fructose, giving no insulin or virtually no insulin secretion, they disappear if you give glucose together with fructose as sucrose, because then you get an insulin peak, and then most of the differences that you observe between the two carbohydrates tend to disappear. One example, if you ingest 50 grams of fructose, I'm pretty sure that more than half of the people here would get diarrhea in the hours following that. If you consume 100 grams of sucrose, which is also 50 grams of sucrose, of glucose and fructose, nobody will get diarrhea. So there is an effect on absorption as such. There is also an effect on metabolism as such. So you see here also maltodextrins that are hydrolyzed starches. You see different types of starch, and the question is, well, what is the best carbohydrate or sugar source during exercise? Now I'll go to some basic, what I call food fuel questions, and I call that DADME. The first is, if we look at carbohydrates, are they really digested in the gut? Then are they absorbed from the gut? How is this? And having mentioned just pure fructose ingestion, you get diarrhea, but together with glucose, you don't get it. You immediately see an effect on the first 2 points here. Is it really distributed to the tissue and the cells? And Luke already pointed out that part of the fructose is converted to lactate. So it does not reach the liver at all. At least 25% reaches the liver as lactate and not as fructose. Is it distributed to the cells? Is it metabolized in the cells? In the gut, in the liver, or in the muscle where we do the physical work? And then finally, or if it is poor metabolism, is it excreted from the gut or from the blood? Of course, if you have fructose malabsorption, it will be excreted from the gut, but most probably it will be fermented by the microbiota in the colon. Now, there has been a long history in determining the best fuels for physical exercise, and progress in technology made it possible to take muscle biopsies. And the first that were doing that were Hultman and Ekström in Sweden. And looking into the biopsy, you could determine the amount of starch that is stored in muscle. That are the white dots that you see here between the round shapes, and the round shapes are the mitochondria. The starch is in there, and what you can also do, you can stain the amount of starch in the muscle fibers. And you see here differently colored muscle fibers, slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fibers. And if there is hardly any color, then the starch is gone or the glycogen has been depleted. And that means that you can look to glycogen depletion patterns in specific muscle fiber types depending on the exercise intensity. Now, with more modern equipment, the NMR machines, we can non-invasively look into muscle and also in liver, and now we can determine the metabolites. You see here ATP, creatine, phosphate, etc. But you can also measure glycogen, and you can even measure lipid content in specific muscle cells, muscles, and also in liver. Now, if we look to food and fuel, there are important things, and I call that DADME, from food to fuel. First, the food goes to the gut. With the food, we get lipid and we get glucose. Lipid, we get enough to store about 12 kilograms of lipid in a lean person, and now with overweight, it may be much more than that. The glucose goes to the liver. In the liver can be stored as glycogen, and the liver or the fat that goes into the body can partly be stored also in muscle along with glucose. And it gives about 300 grams of lipid in total muscle and 350 grams of glucose stored as glycogen in muscle. And we know that the more you are trained endurance athletes, they have higher levels of fat stored in muscle, but also glycogen stored in muscle. And interestingly, we call that the lipid paradox in athletes. Athletes have much higher lipid levels stored, but they are not insulin insensitive. So in type 2 diabetes, you get more lipid stored in the muscle, but it's totally different in the athlete than in this sedentary person. The lipid is enough for a few days of continuous running, and the glycogen is not sufficient to maintain more than an hour of high-intensity exercise. Together with the blood, with the liver, that is important to deliver glucose to the blood to maintain a normal blood glucose level. Now, if you go to exercise physiology, there is just a very interesting review out from Ekan and Zirat in Cell Metabolism Review 2013. It is the best review I've seen thus far, and it gives a number of graphs that are highly interesting. Here you see exercise duration, and you see the percentage of contribution of lipid and fat. And if you look, then you see two cross points here. At the beginning, you see a shift from fat metabolism going down to low lipid and carbohydrate metabolism coming up. And at the end, you again see a shift where fat overrules carbohydrate metabolism. Now, the beginning, the left point, is related to the fact that if you have an immediate increase in energy need, the lipids do not supply sufficient ATP per second to be able to do the exercise. Carbohydrate is much more effective, so you immediately go to a high rate of carbohydrate burning. If you have performed 2 hours of exercise, the glycogen level may have got so low that the energy that is left over is major fat, and then the fat has to take it over, but it has consequences. Now, if you talk about the maximal production rate of ATP per second, so that is the energy flux, then you see this interesting graph. It goes back to 1983, but it has been reconfirmed in a number of studies. The original work was from McGilvery. You see creatine phosphate gives a very high energy flux, followed by glycolysis, which comes from glycogen, rapid anaerobic breakdown. Then you have the aerobic oxidation of carbohydrates, and then you have aerobic fats. And this shows that if you have to perform really intensively, the fuel of choice is carbohydrate. It's not lipid. It's just like if you want to drive a Formula 1, you have a special fuel for that. You cannot drive it on diesel. That is far too slow. You know, you need rapid burning energy, and it's carbohydrate. And based on that, Dave Costell, a long time ago, made this plot related to exercise intensity. If it is low, you burn especially fat and low carbohydrate content. The more intensive the exercise is, the more you will shift to carbohydrate utilization oxidatively and anaerobically. And if you have very high intensity, you see on the right side, between 80 and 100% of VO2 max, you almost burn exclusively carbohydrate and very, very little lipid. Now, that has consequences. This is the Tour de France. It was the time that we were doing research in the Tour de France in Maastricht University, and I was the happy student having Wim Saris as my professor, as my godfather. And what we looked into was the energy expenditure in the Tour de France. And this is from Wim's work with Marie-Agnes van Erbaert, showing that the energy expenditure can go up to 9,000 kilocalories a day when cycling in the mountains. That are the black peaks you see at the bottom line. along with energy expenditure. And what these athletes have learned that if they are not able to eat enough, they are out of the race the next day because they do not recover. The glycogen is empty, they cannot work anymore on high intensity. So they must keep it in pace. And at that time, we knew it was only possible by consuming sugary beverages. And you may ask why, when the dietetics world told us a well-balanced diet, having sufficient carbohydrate of normal food should be sufficient. Well, this is 6,000 calories that we put on a table. There's not even 9,000 calories. If you have to eat that on a single day, so take 1.5 this amount, you have to defecate at least 3 times. And you can't do that because you're sitting on the bike. You have no time for it. So the only way you can manage that is having food intake without all the dietary fibers, which is carbohydrate solutions. Now, we looked into that, and it was part of my thesis, simulating the Tour de France in the respiration chambers. And what we did, I will not go through the whole schedule, but you see here several days, 7 days, day and night measurement we did. On day 4 and day 5, they were cycling an equivalent amount of energy like they did in the Tour de France, about 6,500 kilocalories. And they worked on a workload of 50-80%, and they finished like you finish on a col on a mountain of the first category on the end of the Tour de France. And that signifies the 90% peak at the end workload, and we just looked how long can you maintain that workload. Now, what we saw is if we ingest a normal diet high in carbohydrate versus the same diet supplemented with sugary beverages, you see these curves here. If you look at the bottom curve, the 2 days Tour de France, you see significant increase in blood glucose. If you look to glycerol and free fatty acids, at the same days you see they are significantly reduced. That is because the high blood glucose gives more insulin secretion and has an inhibiting effect on lipid metabolism. But if you then look to glycogen in the muscle, day 3 that was before the 2 days and day 5 that was after the 2 days of Tour de France cycling, you see a tremendous difference. You see that in the normal food without the sugary beverages there was glycogen depletion, there was no recovery. With the sugary beverages you see that they had higher levels at day 5. But what we also see in day 5 and 6 is that the recovery with the sugary beverages is more than complete. We call that supercompensation, that is favorable, whereas the recovery of glycogen on the normal solid food high in carbohydrate was insufficient in 1 day. And that shows us that sugary beverages have a place. And the most striking effect was that if you look to the 90% performance at the end of the day, the group that had normal solid carbohydrate food performed at 9 minutes, and the other group performed the same exercise at 90% for 22 minutes. Now that's the difference between finishing on a mountain of the first category, the ones that cycle up and finish there, and the ones that lose half an hour on the last 60 kilometers uphill. That is the big difference. So that brings me to this graph that shows exercise intensity, and it is similar to what you saw before. If you have 100%, there is virtually no fat utilization or oxidation. You completely rely on carbohydrate, and that's where the Tour de France cyclists learned if you have no carb, you meet the man with the hammer. You can still cycle, but at a very low intensity. And a lot of studies have been done on that respect. You see here a graph from Wagemakers et al. We did at Maastricht University. We gave people sufficient carbohydrate to maintain a high workload. That is on the upper graph, you see, horizontal workload. If they were carbohydrate depleted, their workload capacity dropped to about 40% of maximal workload, which is almost a 50% reduction. You see plasma glucose is high in the center, and the plasma insulin is also highly different. And what we see in this study is that lack of sugars, lack of glucose, leads to a drop of performance capacity, and at the same time you become catabolic and you start to break down proteins which you do not like. Now then I come back to, well, if glucose is so important, what is the most favorable carbohydrate source? And that we can do nowadays with stable isotope technique, where you can measure oxidation rates. And we can do that at rest. You see the person here under the ventilated hood, and we also can do it during exercise. And the methodology is linked to the fact that we have a C3 and C4 plants. In the C4 plants, You see here sugar cane and corn. The one produces sucrose, the other produces starch, then has a naturally enriched carbon pool in photosynthesis, where we have normal 12C and the 13C, that is the stable isotope. The 12C, it says heavy. The 12C is light and the other one is heavy. Now, you can put that in a machine that has a strong magnet. The molecules are led through this, and then you see at the ion detectors, because there is a curve, the heavy ones end up at the outside and the light ones at the inner side. And you can use that to study the amount of carbon-13 that finally comes into the CO2 of your breath. You can take breath samples, and by doing that, you can measure oxidation rates. So finally, what you then do is you take two types of drinks, and you give that to the person, you let the person exercise, and you get the data. Now, you see here a graph from Jeukendrup et al. He looked to the oxidation rate of glucose and glucose plus fructose. And although it is often said that fructose is a slow carbohydrate, it's poorly oxidized, you see here that if you give glucose plus fructose, the curve is on top of the glucose curve. So there is a higher oxidation rate. It was also shown that where there is a higher oxidation rate, there was also a higher plasma lactate in the glucose plus fructose compared to the glucose in the placebo. And this can be explained by the fact that part of the fructose is converted to lactate, but also because there is a higher carbohydrate oxidation, carbohydrate availability, so they are able to perform more intensively, and then you produce more lactate. Now, related to the production of lactate, a very early study was done by Björkman et al. And you see here fructose, intestinal lactate output, that is the upper curve, after consumption of fructose. And from this study, and there have been more studies, we know that about 25 to 30% of fructose ingested is converted to lactic acid in the gut, and as such transported to the liver. Yeah. Now, if you then look to all types of carbohydrates being oxidized, and you see here a plot from Jeukendrup, it's a nice review. You see here carbohydrates that are glucose, that are fructose, that are sucrose, that are galactose, different types of carbohydrates. But what you see here is that at the far end, the highest oxidation rates, that are the three square dots in the top circle, that is the combination of glucose and fructose. And they are higher than equivalent amount of carbohydrate given as free glucose. And that means that the combination of the two may have beneficial effects. And that is what you see in power output. How well are the athletes able to perform? You see here glucose in the middle and glucose plus fructose. Equicaloric amounts leads to a higher performance capacity. And similarly, we have seen in other time trials that we have done where the people getting glucose plus fructose, in this case it was sucrose, you see placebo and the sucrose drink, the curves all go down, they have a better performance capacity. In this case it was a 2.3% performance increase. So if I put that together and I say, well, what are now the aspects of carbohydrate availability? Now, first of all, if we have lack of carbohydrate, the muscle fibers that do the most intensive work cannot work anymore because they can only oxidize carbohydrate. They don't oxidize lipid. So if we deplete carbohydrate, we get a decrease in performance. At the same time, the body is stressed. We start to break down proteins and we increase amino acid oxidation. Because of the stress, the catecholamines going up, we have an increased fat oxidation, we get a shift in catabolic-anabolic ratio, and because of that, the recovery time to the next day is prolonged. The people feel tired, the next day they are still tired. If we give abundant carbohydrate, then we see an increase in performance capacity, we see a drop in amino acid oxidation, we also see a drop in fat oxidation, simply because there is more glucose in the blood, there is more lactate in the blood, and there is more insulin in the blood. And those have an effect on lipolysis. The catabolic-anabolic ratio goes down, and therefore the recovery time decreases. And that is what we saw in the Tour de France simulation day. If we give abundant carbohydrate, they have a recovery from one day to the other, which is more than 100%, versus insufficient recovery without the sugary beverages. So if I take that together, I could say that glucose plus fructose is the better combination for supporting glucose availability, performance capacity, the recovery of liver glycogen, and that is because fructose plus lactate favor glycogen recovery in the liver above that of glucose. But also the recovery of muscle glycogen, because most of the glucose taken up from the blood passes the liver and goes to the muscle. So we have two stimuli for glycogen resynthesis in the liver and in the muscle that are distinct. Pure sugar, saccharose, is the cheapest solution. Maltodextrins plus fructose in a ratio of 70:30 about may be the optimal solution for athletes, but is much more expensive, and that's the reason that all of the energy drinks available are based on sucrose. If we have sufficient glucose, we can maintain 100% performance capacity. If we have lack of glucose, it drops to about 50% of performance capacity. That's when we meet the man with the hammer, or that is in the second half of the soccer game when the athletes are not able to sprint anymore so well, etc. Athletes benefit from carbohydrate intake during high intensity. It leads to delayed fatigue and improved performance. That's very, very clear. But the big market or the big population is all the recreational athletes. Do they have a benefit from these type of sugary beverages? The answer is no, because there is no glycogen depletion. They have no benefit. They only have a benefit if they decide to run half a marathon and they go to their personal best time or their personal limit, because then they perform in top sports on their own level. That's different. But if you play a game of tennis or just an hour of soccer for fun, you have no benefit. So having said that, sugars or sugary beverages, that is serious fuel for serious sport. This is an advertising of one of the companies that brings this. You have a maximum intensity, you have oxidation rates of around 1 to 1.5 grams per minute, which is about 48 to 90 grams of sugars per hour. So then you must ingest it to maintain your performance capacity. But the same company also makes this advertisement, and it shows children and happy people that are not exercising. Now, if you have low or moderate exercise intensity, you have oxidation rates that are less than 8.8 grams per minute in the range of 0.3 to 0.6, which is about 20 to 40 grams per hour. That is very, very minor, and in fact, you don't need that amount. And what we see is that most recreational athletes, they feel that they are top athletes, they consume considerably more, they have an overconsumption of energy with no benefit at all. Last slide, we see that there is a lot of consumption of energy drinks, particularly by young children, because they are extremely sweet and young children love the sweetness. Where we know that if top athletes would drink these energy drinks, they have 150 up to 165 grams of sucrose per liter, they would start to vomit because of overload of the gut of these sugars. Children love it, they drink it, and they have an overconsumption of sugars. And I feel this should be strongly discouraged. It's the wrong way to go. This was my last slide, and if there are any questions, I would be happy to take.